This program is brought to you by Emory University.
The panel will be moderated by Judge Doyle, and we'll have joining us Ambassador Kopech, Judge Lovett, Judge Camacho, and Camilla will be rejoining us, for a discussion about how to recognize these victims and how to understand their needs once we identify who they are. So please join me in welcoming our panel. And if you're ready, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Doyle. I am currently the Chief Judge at the Georgia Court of Appeals. And I'm going to start off just by briefly introducing to you our panelists. I think you should know each of them by now, but just in case. To my left is Susan Kopech. She is the Ambassador at Large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, as well as the Senior Advisor to the Secretary of State. She was confirmed by the Senate and appointed by Barack Obama in 2015. She is charged with leading the U.S. Global's engagement against human trafficking. Her office assesses global trends, provides strategic foreign assistance funding, and engages foreign governments, civil society, other federal agencies, and key stakeholders in the fight against modern slavery. Previously, she served here as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Northern District of Georgia for 15 years. She received the Department of Justice's Director's Award of Superior Performance as an AUSA, and was also awarded a Fulbright Ian Axford Fellowship in Public Policy, where she spent 6 months in New Zealand's Ministry of Justice working on their human trafficking laws and prosecutions. We are excited to have her here today and welcome her back to Georgia. To her left, we're going out of order, is Judge Willie Lovett Jr. He is just from down the street. He is a juvenile court judge here in the Atlanta Judicial Circuit of Fulton County, Georgia, where he provides leadership over the court's CHINS protocol implementation and dual status youth initiative. He is also certified by the American Bar Association and the National Association of Counsel for Children as a child welfare law specialist. A graduate of Harvard Law School, prior to taking the bench, he managed the Fulton County Office of the Child Attorney, government office of 18 attorneys, in addition to investigators, administrators, and social workers. And I personally observed some of the cases that he handled while I was at the Court of Appeals, and he always did a very good job. He also spent many years in the office of the county attorney, managing litigation. Welcome, Judge Lovett. To his left, we have the Honorable Fernando Camacho. He comes to us from New York. He is the acting Supreme Court judge on the New York State Court of Claims, a graduate of Fordham University School of Law. He began his practice in the Manhattan's DA's office, where he spent several years in the trial division and the sex crimes unit. In 1997, he was appointed to the bench, eventually being transferred to the Queens County Criminal Court, where he presided over domestic violence court and a specialized court dealing with teenagers who were charged with prostitution. After elevation to the New York State Court of Claims, he was appointed to the position of County Administrative Judge for criminal matters in Queens County. He also presided over the Youth Diversion Part, a specialized court dealing with adolescents charged with felony offenses. Since 2013, he has been assigned to the Suffolk County Superior Court. Welcome, Judge Camacho. And I don't know what you already learned about Attorney Camilla Wright, but she is the human trafficking prosecutor at the state of Georgia's Office of the Attorney General. She has an LLM in international law and a strong background, obviously, in criminal law. She's a graduate of the University of North Carolina School of Law. She also studied abroad, working on international law and human rights programs. She spent some time at the University of Amsterdam, learning about international public law and humanitarian law, among others, before eventually moving to Georgia and joining the AG's office. So thank you for being here today. I've confessed to this panel that I can remember one case in the last 8 on the Court of Appeals that I have had that dealt with, it was a criminal matter, and it was someone who was trafficking young women. And so there's had one in all that time that sticks out. So I am not an expert in this area, so I'm going to try to stay out of the way of this fantastic group so they can just talk to you about the things. What I do know, it's a modern day form of slavery, but when I thought about it, I thought about, well, human trafficking, okay, that's just prostitution. But when I started looking at some of the things that was sent to me in preparation for that, it is so much broader than that. There are 20 million victims globally, a lot of them forced into labor. It can be women, men, adults, children, citizens, and non-citizens. So in this segment, we're going to try to focus on how to recognize the victim, how to understand their needs, and things that the judicial system is doing to help. So with that, our first kind of throw-out question is, can you describe for me who are the victims, and especially Ambassador Coppage? I know we think of it here, locally there's the young prostitute on the street, but talk to us a little bit about who these victims are nationally and internationally.
Yeah, I think that your summary was really good. So this is an international problem, meaning it happens everywhere, including here in Georgia. And the victims are people who are vulnerable for one reason or another. So as Camilla alluded to earlier, it can be runaways or throwaways. It can be migrants in search of a better economic opportunity. On a global scale, it can be refugees fleeing natural disaster, as just occurred in Haiti, or crimes and military coups, as is happening in Syria. So the migration crisis in Europe and the migration crisis up from Central America that's a little closer to home here, those can create vulnerabilities for people so that the trafficker swoops in and starts selling the American dream, right? Things can get better, you can have a good job, you can bring your family sooner or later, you can live in this house, anything a person needs. It can be love and affection, it can be a job, it can be just a place to lay your head. So anything that creates that opening for the trafficker to come in can create trafficking victims. So I think it's important as we go through the day that we think about it not just being children or women, but it can be adults, it can be LGBTQ individuals who face other societal pressures that may make them vulnerable. There's a whole range of individuals who can be victims.
So in Fulton Juvenile Court, as many people know, Atlanta is a hub for human trafficking. We have the airport, we have highways to converge into the city, and oftentimes in juvenile court you see the runaways who come in and don't have that kind of parental support at home. They're rarely living at home. Their parents seem to be okay with it, and they're taken care of, and you're wondering how this can happen. I was sworn in as a juvenile judge on May 21, 2013. May 22nd, I did a delinquency calendar, and one of the kids was a 12-year-old who had been picked up at Walmart for shoplifting condoms, KY jelly, and a pregnancy kit. Her home was in a small town in Mississippi, and she had been coming to Atlanta to visit her boyfriend, whose name was Pee-wee. And that was how she got here. And it was tough. First case, it was tough. But what it did is it opened my eyes to the fact that these kids are victims and they're not the criminals that many of us see them as. These kids are victims. And whenever you see those cases and whenever you're dealing with them, you have to shift your mindset from thinking of these kids as prostitutes, as criminals, but you have to figure out how to get them help. Fortunately, we were able to get her into one of our programs. Georgia Baptist, they have a program to rehabilitate these children, and her mom allowed us to keep her here instead of sending her back to Mississippi so that she could run back to Pee-wee. And after she finished the program, she's not shown up in my court again, so I'm hoping that it worked. But those are some of the stories that you see for these victims.
I deal mostly with domestic sex trafficking. And when you mention trafficking to people, the first thing that pops into their heads is international, coming across international borders, been put in these cages, and that happens. We have victims of domestic trafficking right in our midst, right in our own backyards, as my friend Tokos already likes to say. And let me read you a quote from a young survivor in the Yale Law Review. And this is who we're dealing with. We've all been molested over and over and raped. We were all molested and sexually abused as children. Don't you know that? We ran to get away. We were thrown out, thrown away. We've been on the streets since we were 12, 13, 14. That's who they are. And there's a principle, mental health principle called dissociation. Do you ever look at a kid and you look into their eyes and their eyes are dead? It's like their soul's been plucked out of them. There's nothing there. It's just blank. When you look at a victim of trafficking, a young victim of trafficking, you see that blank stare. And it's called dissociation. When you engage in sexual intercourse and sexual relations with strangers over and over and over again, and you're brutalized and you're beaten and you're raped, you tune out. Take the plug out, because you don't want to feel anything. And all you have is just this lifeless, dead eyes. Those are the victims of trafficking. And those are the people, those are the kids who the pimps prey on, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable.
And just to reiterate, our traffickers prey on our most vulnerable. And we see trafficking really wherever we look for it. The reason Atlanta is known as a hub for human trafficking is because back before it became popular and trendy, Judge Nina Hickson with the Fulton County Juvenile Court started identifying girls at the time being brought in with prostitution charges and recognized that something else was going on, and really has led the charge for the city and for the state. So we're known for human trafficking because we're willing to look for it and address it. And they prey on the most vulnerable, and it's not just that in the juvenile courts we find human trafficking victims. My very first trial was one of the cases where the pimp was picking up girls who were waiting for the bus outside of juvenile court. This victim was only there for unruly charges. She was getting in fights with her mom. She'd never done anything like this. She'd never even run away. And he picked her up, offered her a ride home, and that was it, because he knew where you got to find vulnerable people. Juvenile court can be a great place. One of the ways, I was the Fulton County human trafficking prosecutor for a while, and one of the ways we brought our case count from 2 to 20 within a very short period of time was learning to identify cases that were already charged, but cases that were charged as domestic violence cases, or kids and they were drug cases and they were happening in hotels, or stat rape cases that happened in hotels, or assaults, women going screaming down the road where someone was getting arrested on an assault by a patrol officer. Detectives were not even called out. No one was trying to figure out what was going on in that house. Why was she running and screaming? Oh, because she got beat up because she didn't make enough money that night sleeping with enough men.
So, Judge Doyle, can I just add, one of the things when judges start hearing these cases that I want to caution about is that you're not always going to see the same fact pattern. We have had cases where the victims were the first one to make contact with the trafficker. They were looking online and wanted just someone to talk to. So the victim initiated contact. Or the victim may already have been in prostitution by herself. So it's not always the trafficker that swoops in as this evil figure. And so it's important for judges to understand that there are many different types of trafficking cases, although all of them, as the panel has talked about, really are based on a vulnerability. Whether it's initiated by the victim or the trafficker. And I also, because we're sitting here at Emory, want to talk about one of the first cases I had that was all adult women, including college students, including one here at Emory, including one at Clark Atlanta. They never lived with the trafficker. They lived independent of him. And yet he was able to maintain control over them through threats and blackmail and physical attacks. So they weren't even living with him, and we had to convince a court that he was causing the young women to engage in commercial sex for his benefit. So they're not always going to look the same way, and I think that's important as you start seeing these cases in your court to keep in mind that they don't fit a fact pattern.
That sounds exactly the kind of thing you have to change a mindset on, I think, trying to, grasp with that kind of concept, because, you sit here and I think to myself, well, just walk away, go find somebody, but, the mental, I guess, anguish that these people are going through is something that needs to be understood. We've talked a lot about, the sex trafficking. I'd like to hear a little bit about what other kinds of, the forced labor, and how do you recognize that? I mean, how do you figure that out, and who these victims are, and dealing with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think internationally, that's certainly more people are trafficked through labor cases than sexual cases. And I'm going to address that this afternoon with a labor trafficking panel as well. But they are even harder to find and prosecute than sex trafficking cases. This afternoon we'll talk about a few federal cases. I don't believe the state has had one yet. But you can be trafficked for any type of work. And it's also if you agree to do the work, but then the work turns out not to be something you agreed to, you're not being paid, you're in debt bondage, then that can also lead to labor trafficking.
Yeah, I understand that a lot of times the labor trafficking involves people from the same nationality, and they're taking advantage of people who not necessarily brought over here, not English speaking, so they have a hard time communicating, things like that. What would be some of the other things that you would look for to identify someone who might be in a circumstance? Key indicators that would put them in those positions.
Some of the key indicators, if it is a child who is completely displaced, a child from another state, we see that frequently, children from around Georgia, children from other states, and they pop up picking up what I call a survival crime, like they get caught with stealing food or stealing underwear or stealing the tools that they may need to do their sex, to be victims of sex trafficking. You also see circumstances where children for extended times are not living at home. And you wonder, how does this happen? Where is the child? Where are they spending their time? These to me are kind of the red flags that I see, and sometimes they don't all necessarily come in through the delinquency system. We do the chins, which are most of our runaway cases, and a high percentage of the runaway cases, the child is either vulnerable or involved in human sex trafficking. So you have to look really behind the issue and ask the question, how are these young people surviving when they're not at home or getting any support at home? And that's kind of the red flag I look for.
Another red flag you can deal with if it's a labor case, if the address is the same as the place of business. Also, is there an adult in court who seems to be in charge, especially if it's a non-family member or even a family member if you're dealing with an adult. And you want to keep in mind, like Susan said, they don't all look like what you expect them to look like. We have female traffickers as well. You want to be careful if you're dealing with a translator, and I think something that Judge Camacho is going to talk about later is those other people in the courtroom.
I'll talk about it now. I always look around the courtroom, every person who appears before me, I look around, is there anybody here for you? And then there's that big guy in the back. Who's that? That's my cousin. Oh, really? Okay. A couple of years ago, there was a young woman she was charged with stealing, she was in possession of a stolen car. And she's a 17-year-old little girl, and I could see the look. I recognize it. And I said, and she's waving to some guy in the back. I said, who's that? That's my pastor. Really? That's your pastor? Okay. So I had one of the defense attorney asked her to have one of the social workers talk to the pastor. Yeah, he's a pastor already, and he's in charge of this church, and she goes there. But he also was trafficking her. So I like to look around the courtroom. Who's here for you? And there's telltale signs.
I think it's also, maybe the judges can address this. You don't have victims that are like always excited to have your help or your interference, as they may see it. That you don't have victims that are like, yay, finally, someone that can help me. They're not necessarily going to self-identify, even in what all of us would consider a safe environment, which is a courtroom. And I would love to hear what you do when you have those kind of recalcitrant.
I have been called every single name in the book. You effing this and that. And you know, and the more they rant and they rave, the more I think I'm succeeding. You know why? Because when they get rearrested, they know that I care about them, and they know I'm disappointed. So the stronger the rage, the more that they're trying to just, I don't care if you care about me, don't care about me. No, I don't want anybody to care about me. How dare you? There's so much trauma. They've built up so much layer upon layer of this walls, because that little part of them that was once a little kid, that innocence, is lost so far deep within them. And you have to have a thick skin if you're going to work with this population. You can't be afraid of being called every name in the book, and the more they rant and they rave and scream at you, the more progress you're making, because they know that you care and you're disappointed, and they're disappointed in themselves.
Does mental or physical health play a role in this? I know a lot of times we talk about the runaways and things like that, but do you find that some of these individuals are more prone to having, mental issues, things along those lines? Does that ever come up in any of your courtrooms?
Oh my goodness, I'm sorry, Judge.
Yeah, I was just going to say, being trauma-informed and understanding trauma and the reaction to trauma, oftentimes, especially in young kids, that may appear to be mental illness, but the reality is these victims have been traumatized, and many of their behaviors, many of the outbursts, many of the involuntary actions that they may engage in, that you may believe is a mental health issue, is a trauma reaction. These kids, no 12-year-old girl is going to volunteer to walk around in their underwear on a dangerous street trying to pick up men in a car. That's just not normal for a 12-year-old girl. And when you get these cases, you have to understand that there are layers and layers of trauma and therapy that these children need to go through to get to a point of being a normal child again. So the trauma is the thing that I look for.
PTSD, depression, Stockholm Syndrome. I like reading, the survivors inspire me, so I like reading their quotes to you, because when I hear this, it really hits home. This is from a young survivor in my part. I was in Covenant House. I met him in the park, and he told me all about himself, making him seem like a guy who really wanted to get to know a female. And he asked me all about myself, my sign, what I wanted to do with my life. And then I went on the track. I was 15, he was 26 or 27. I had nowhere to go, no food, no money. So I went on the track. I saw females get stabbed, get doped up, slip Mickeys by their pimps forcing drugs into their system. I've seen a gun pointed at females' heads. I've been in life and death situations, getting choked out, getting beat up for no reason, or because you don't bring in a lot of money. You get really stressed out in this game. If you're not doing drugs when you come in, you leave with it. You don't care about yourself, really. You feel there's no help, and you just want to go to a suicide house. Those are the words of a survivor, and that's the life. So you don't think they're going to have some mental health issues?
So how does the court deal with that? You've been to court, you sit there in court, and you've got this is talking about you need doctors, and you need, places for these people to stay, and that's a lot of times beyond what you can do sitting behind the bench, or when you're thinking about prosecuting or defending these kids. What do you do?
One of the things I always asked our courts to do, and I'm sure the the prosecutors here do, is to not use real names. Just like a rape victim, you would protect the identity of adults or children who are commercial sex victims. I would also ask the judge if things got emotional or it looked like the victim was really struggling, if we could take breaks. As I'm traveling the world in my current job, many countries don't have the right to confrontation that is so enshrined in our Constitution, and so they allow victims to testify outside the presence of their traffickers. I don't believe we will ever have that option here, but I would ask judges to please be sensitive to the traumas that these people have experienced, and to let the witness kind of progress through what happened at their pace. I think that's really important.
And there was a new law, I believe 3 years ago, new legislation that now allows children under 15 who have been traumatized and who would be traumatized to testify via closed caption. And that was a result of a case where 3 juveniles were trafficked by their parents and uncles and grandparents. And in addition, and we're going to have a panel later to talk about some of the services that we have specifically in Georgia, and the trauma-informed services and how important that is. But the other thing is to understand that this Stockholm Syndrome, this trauma bonding, and understand why your victims may be recanting, why your prosecutors may be having trouble getting them into court, why just the nature, how similar these cases are to domestic violence cases, and we learned a lot about domestic violence cases almost starting in the 80s, and I think trafficking in our education level is kind of where we were with domestic violence in the 80s, where we're learning why she recanted or why she went back to him, why she didn't run, why she doesn't identify as a victim. It could be some very similar mental health reasons, and sometimes the experts that I use are just our regular domestic violence victims because what's happened looks identical to a domestic violence situation.
Yeah, it sounds like drug addiction also plays a part in this.
I was just going to say, many of these children will test positive for drugs, and it's almost self-medicating. You know, many of them use marijuana to disassociate, and it's not necessarily an addiction, although it may appear that way, but it's trying to, in the best way they know how, you know, like deal with the trauma that they're going through.
I think you need to be, going back to your question, Judge Doyle, and how do the judges deal with these really damaged kids, broken kids? Be very careful. I had a conversation a long time ago with a woman named Rachel Lloyd, who you may know, and I said to her, and I was negotiating with the district attorney about how we're going to set up this part, what the kids need to do in order to get the dismissal. And DA is like, I want 15 sessions in the classroom where they're being lectured. I said, okay. I said to Rachel, what should I tell this district attorney? He goes, Judge, I got a secret to tell you. Please don't share it. When they come see me, when you send them to me, first time, I'd take them to the movies. Then I'd take them for ice cream. Then I'd take them for a walk around the park. I said, Rachel, I can't tell the DA that. Yeah, I know. It's not about lecturing them. It's about getting their trust and their confidence. It's about getting them to believe that somebody cares about them. And it's just that human one-on-one interaction that's what helps. And it's not sitting them down in the classroom and lecturing them about the dangers. It's about making them feel that somebody cares.
And Attorney General Owens mentioned how hard these cases are to try, and particularly prosecutors are used to hearing, or wanting to hear, the truth from a witness, right? And the first story you hear from a trafficking victim is never the truth. So automatically, the defense lawyer's like, oh, good, I got a contradictory statement coming up, right? And the cross-examination is there for that. And I think it's really important for courts to understand that that is a logical progression. Why would you tell somebody you don't even know the truth about this traumatic situation that's been happening to you? Potentially about the person that you think you care for and that cares for you, or who's threatening you or your family, or who you're tied to through any of these psychological bonds. A lot of the evidence you'll see in a trafficking case will involve love notes between the victim and the trafficker. That is so counterintuitive to what we think would be going on. And so that first story that you'll hear in court, just because the witness isn't truthful doesn't mean this didn't happen. So we have to educate law enforcement and prosecutors about that, but also judges and juries. We need to let them know that this is kind of the progression of establishing trust with law enforcement for a system that may not have been there for these individuals, that they may have experienced as a defendant themselves. All of a sudden, an enlightened judge or a friendly prosecutor is telling them all these things that don't jive with reality. So we need to understand, again, from this victim-centered perspective, this trauma-centered perspective, and that's why, as Attorney General Owens mentioned, it's so important to have vacature for an expungement of records. New York was actually the first state that passed it, although it limited it to prostitution offenses. Florida came along 3 or 4 years ago and made it for all criminal offenses, not just prostitution. So we need to make the justice system be justice for the victims as well.
You know, I have just thinking about that, I was, okay, is there a point at which, because I know that a lot of this is repeat offenders, unfortunately. They come in, and just like a lot of people who commit, crimes that, for whatever reason, and here the circumstances are driving these people, so they're back and they keep coming back. Is there a point at which they have to be, do we convert them back to the criminal defendant? I mean, how do you approach that? Is there a point at which whether you give up or do you never give up on these kind of victims? How do you figure that out?
Chorus, you never give up, right?
Right.
You never give up, but sadly I have had a case where despite all of the interference, this girl was first trafficked when she was 14 and we prosecuted, and her trafficker is gone. After many, many encounters with her, she was suddenly an adult trafficking younger girls. And while we still don't give up on her, and we're so glad there's so many programs and adult programs that are willing to take her, she still is convicted of human trafficking because we have to protect our children. And you never give up, but sometimes I really think there is a place for holding somebody accountable in that. Recognizing where they've come from, because you're going to have this with especially with your female pimps, recognizing where they come from, but also giving them the dignity of holding them accountable for some of their actions as adults. And I may be disagreed with on this.
You never give up because, first of all, if you understand, as I do, that many of them don't have the ability to just walk away and leave. They can't because they're going to be harmed. So they're going to be back out there, and you understand that. So you never give up. I gave up only once, not really give up, but I did with her when she was recruiting other young women to her pimp and for her pimp, and she was giving away the location of safe houses. I said, well, you went over the line, so I can't work with you anymore. But other than that, you never give up.
One of the things that we as judges have to recognize is part of the brainwashing and part of the conversion and part of the trauma is that they're taught not to trust the judicial system. And that first story that you get that's never true is part of a practiced dialogue between the child and their trafficker as to what they will tell the judge, who you will tell the judge I am, and why I should have custody of you, and he's going to give you back to me anyway. It's those kinds of things that we're battling that they have been trained to spot out this information from the time that they've been trafficked. So there is an initial almost automatic distrust of everything that's going on. They're not to trust their defense attorneys, they're not to trust the judge, and they're not to trust the prosecutor. Everybody's after them except the pimp, except the peewee that loves them. And you have to understand that there is a layer of trust building. As Judge Camacho has just said, there is a layer of trust building before you can get any type of result.
We've talked a little bit about the techniques used to control the victims. And Ambassador Coppedge, you mentioned the case with the university students, which has now been mulling around in my brain of how, and so I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. You know, we know, I think of, you know, okay, we've got somebody under lock and key. Yeah, that's, you can't get away, but it's obviously that wasn't the case. You know, from what you learned from that case, how did that individual control these people?
And there's a lot of shame and embarrassment that comes into trafficking that's used by the traffickers to control. And that's why those terms in the law, the federal and state law, deception and coercion, are so great. I would tell juries in the federal law it's called fraud, not deception. But I would say basically that's telling a lie, right? If they lie to you about what you're going to be doing to get you to do that act, to get you to engage in commercial sex, that's trafficking. That's a really low legal bar. Prosecutors say, yay. Because, I mean, fraud is a lie. And this trafficker lied to these young girls. He actually picked very beautiful young women and told them he was a talent manager and was going to get them in rap videos. And he would take them to parties where there were Atlanta music stars, and they all thought he was connected. And then they had to get comfortable with their bodies so they could dance in these videos, and the best place to do that was in strip clubs. So he had them working in strip clubs. And then he would point out a few people in the room and say, that's a guy that you need to be really nice to because he's going to help get you in the video. And he would encourage the young women to have sex with these men. And then he would record that. And then once he had that video, he told them he was going to show everybody on campus what they were doing. And I left out the part where he had them sign a contract because he was their talent manager. And in signing that contract, they agreed to pay him $250 a week so that he could get them in these music videos. And as part of the contract, they gave over their social security numbers. So now he was also using their social security numbers to ruin their credit. He was extorting money from them, and how were they going to make money? So again, not ever living with them, not under any lock and key. One of these young women was from California. Her mother was an attorney. She didn't tell her mom what was going on because she was so embarrassed. She was so afraid everybody at Emory was going to see the video of her having sex with people. And that's not force. There's no, he would beat when he needed to, but most traffickers don't want to engage in physical force because that damages their product. They want to manipulate more suavely in their minds. So those cases are really, really hard because they don't involve the media image I've still never seen taken, but they don't involve kidnapping. They don't involve handcuffs in all cases. So those are really hard to get people thinking about that being a trafficking situation.
Can you tell us, were you successful in this?
I have yet to lose a trafficking case. So I left the courtroom on a high. That was one of our earlier cases. That was in 2007. And after, this is judges and lawyers, I'm a storyteller, so you'll have to just indulge me for a moment. I had two traffickers that wanted to proceed pro se. And again, this is part of that control. They wanted to be the ones in control in the courtroom. They were very suave. They were going to persuade the jury what the situation was, and they also wanted to question the victims directly. So two of them at the same time proceeding pro se. But after opening statements, when this particular defendant, Jimmy Jones, got outraged and started pounding the podium, and you could see the jury shrinking away from him and understanding why these young girls would be afraid of him, he pled and was sentenced to 15 years. So.
Judge Camacho, we got you down here from New York, and I got the 15-minute and counting sign, so I don't want to miss this. You have, as I understand, started some human trafficking courts up there. Can you talk to us about that? Tell us what you've done, how you got them set up, lessons learned. What do we need to know?
Sure. In New York, about 20 years ago, if you picture this scenario, you have a police officer walking up to a car where two people are engaged in sex, and one's a 42-year-old married father of four, another was a 15-year-old girl. There's a guy lurking in the shadows counting his money, and the police officer knocks on the window, all right, stop, get dressed. You would think, right, that the 42-year-old guy would get arrested for statutory rape. The guy counting the money, who was her pimp, would get arrested for trafficking, and she would be sent to these compassionate social workers, and she'd be sent to a trauma unit, and she'd get all the help that she needs. But what actually happened was these girls would be taken away in handcuffs, and these two guys would walk, and they would go about their business. And she would go to court where in court we would play Let's Make a Deal, where the prosecutor would say, Judge, this is the fifth arrest. I'm asking for 30 days in jail. The defense attorney would say, Judge, she's a kid, 10 days. The judge would say 20 days. That's the way we did it 20 years ago in New York. And that's how we dealt with young kids who were victims of trafficking and prostituted. After seeing that for many, many years as a prosecutor and as a judge, one day I had enough. In 2003, I had enough. I had a young woman walk into my courtroom, 16 years old, 6 prior arrests for prostitution, and I was about to give her 10 days in jail. And I said, stop, kid, why are you here? There was the big guy in the back, giving her signs, take it, don't take it, you offer. I said, kid, why are you here? I called everybody up. No, I want her back in my courtroom next week. I want to know what her story is. And I got her story, and I got dozens and dozens and dozens of other stories after that. So informally, we formed the first ever sex trafficking part. Nobody knew about it but me initially, and then everybody found out. And now in New York State, here we are, 15 years later, we have 12 different human trafficking intervention courts that have provided services to over 9,000 people, persons charged with prostitution. And they don't treat them as victims, as criminals anymore, as we used to. We treat them as the victims that they are.
So, besides dealing with, the victims in your court, what kind of other programs do you interact with to provide them services? How do these trafficking courts work up in New York?
Well, if you want to start a trafficking court, I make the following suggestions. Don't go to your administrative supervising judge and say, I need money, I need resources, I need money from your budget. Tell them I can do it with nothing. And you know what? Three basic principles. Number one, you got to beg, borrow, and steal if something is worthwhile. So I would walk around at different other diversion courts to a drug court. Can I borrow your case manager for a minute, resource coordinator? And the second principle is if you build it, they will come. And if you build something that works, that's doing great work, that everybody sees is doing great work, everybody wants to be part of it. And the third thing is, you know what, you want to start one of these courts, be creative. I had no resources. It was me and Rachel Lloyd in a little, small, dark courtroom in Queens County, talking about how we were going to deal with this problem. And be creative. Be creative. I reached out to social welfare school. And Dean, you have any master's students who want to be involved in something from the ground up and get involved? And just be creative. There's so many resources out there that if your cause is worthwhile, people will come.
Okay. Judge Lovett, I know that we do have some things going on here, and I was going to have you and Attorney Wright talk a little bit about what programming we do have so far and the concept of regional thinking we discussed.
Right, so if you think about what you've heard thus far, we talk about the juveniles, but then we talk about the young adults, and then we talk about the adults who may become now the new recruiters or the traffickers. But there is a continuum of these victims from juvenile court all the way through to our adult system. And so one of the things that we are talking about in Fulton as we're conceptualizing handling or developing a human trafficking intervention program, we're looking at possibly figuring out a way, and again, you have to be creative, but figuring out a way to track the kids who are in my court who start showing up in municipal court and state court for the minor violations. We have not figured out the answer yet, but we're looking at that. On the same token, we have discussed regional partnerships among several juvenile court judges. So what we have seen in Fulton, DeKalb, Douglas, Cobb, and the metro area, many of these victims live in hotels when they give you their home address as a hotel. However, if you look deeper, they may have a case. I got a case of a young transsexual male who had 2 files of history in Clayton County before he got to Fulton County. And again, they were living in these hotels, traveling from county to county and doing the same thing and starting over, getting the same services, and then disappearing. So one of the things that we're looking at is looking at setting up some kind of regional juvenile network, and within Fulton County, a cross-court collaborative as we go forward. And again, I don't know exactly how we're going to do it, but we're going to move forward and make it happen.
And that's such an important thing. We've worked so hard with law enforcement to coordinate their efforts, because these aren't your basic child abuse case happens in one bedroom in one house in one jurisdiction. But these kids and these adults are trafficked always across borders, and it involves multiple jurisdictions, and we want to make sure that people don't fall through the cracks, and that somebody that Clayton has been working with for a long time doesn't get missed when they show up in Fulton. But also in Georgia, we're actually known across the country for our coordinated efforts, particularly for our domestic minor sex trafficking, our CSEC victims. We have an organization called Georgia Cares. It was actually started out of the Governor's Office of Children and Families, and they help coordinate our services for our juvenile victims, for our identified and confirmed trafficking victims under 18. We also have organizations that we work with regularly that deal with our adults, individual homes, and then agencies that'll go out, or organizations that'll go out and pick up our kids, like Out of Darkness, who you'll hear from. We have Tapestry here. Tapestry actually has a federal grant for international victims for the Southeast, but they're housed here in Atlanta, so they do so much work here, and they have so many resources. And again, we'll get you those contacts by the end of the day. But one thing that Fulton County Juvenile Court has, and that really started first, was a program for the at-risk youth. Because as we've been talking, you know, an at-risk youth is very often someone we know is a trafficking victim, but they're not willing to talk yet, and we have not been able to confirm. Well, they've got a program there at the Fulton County Juvenile Courts that will work with that youth right when they have those vulnerability factors, even before they're confirmed, to address trafficking issues, whether they have been trafficked yet or not.
Right, that's our Youth Spark program, and I did want to give a plug for that. I'm glad you reminded me, because I completely forgot. But Youth Spark is a program dealing with at-risk and trafficked youth. These are females, however, it provides a family therapeutic atmosphere for these young girls, and it was started back with Judge Nina Hickson, and it has gone on in continuum, although the corporate name has changed a few times. But they really do a good job in helping these victims become empowered and to gain their sense of self back. And one of the things that Youth Spark is doing now is they're training other jurisdictions on how to duplicate that program in their own areas.
We are in the closing out in the last few minutes. I just wanted to turn it over to each of you and see if there's just one sort of bit of advice, kind of the key thing you think is important for people to think about when trying to identify the victims. Just sort of a closing remark, if you would.
So the State Department funds training for judges and prosecutors and law enforcement worldwide. So we believe it's very important to communicate to courts about this different type of crime, to communicate about the victim-centered perspective you've heard so much about. I can tell you internationally, when I'm on a panel, they don't keep us to our time, so I'm really impressed with, it makes the whole day easier if everybody does that. But I want to leave you with 3 comments that I heard while a prosecutor from judges to, again, start to shift your perception of how you view these cases. One involved a 15-year-old girl who had left with her boyfriend from Arkansas. She'd been sexually active with him, and then he trafficked her at truck stops between Arkansas and Georgia. And at the sentencing, the judge said the female victim had been rather worldly before this trip started. That absolutely broke my heart, because that's not a victim-centered perspective. In another case that involved a foreign victim who had been trafficked in for domestic servitude, and we'll do more about labor trafficking this afternoon, the foreign victim under our federal laws was allowed to stay here under a trafficking visa. And the judge said, well, the young woman did get something out of this. Okay. Again, not a victim-centered perspective. And the last comment from a judge was that the women that he was seeing in my case weren't pretty enough for anyone to pay to sleep with. Okay? So I don't want any of the judges in this room to have perspectives that would lead to those comments, but to have the perspective of the young person or the child or the young woman or man in front of them and to think about the trauma they've been through.
My closing thought, and several of my juvenile court colleagues are here, learn how to, one, believe in these victims and to believe in their ability to do better. When you invest in them, there will be a lot of disappointment. There will be a lot of steps forward and you feel like steps backward. But, stick with them and have hope and give them that idea that they can get their life back. And sometimes it may deal with being a little rough or a little harsh, but as long as you do it with that sense that you have hope and belief in them in recovering, I think that you can make a difference. Whether you're a lawyer, judge, prosecutor, whatever you're doing, I think that if you go in victim-centered focus, understanding trauma, and believe that they can get better, that you can make a difference.
I think the key and the real struggle is this, and that's why I'm here, and I thank you for inviting me. And that's why I'm here. That's why I always, anytime anybody invites me to talk at these events, I always come, and that's because the real struggle is this, is changing the hearts and minds. And in this way, when I first started talking about this, a real person that I really respect, and the district attorney said to me, Fernando, they're prostitutes, just like prostitutes. In other words, they're miscreants, they're bad girls who enjoy doing this stuff. They're not. They're damaged, broken, vulnerable little kids. They're children. And if we can't protect our children, what kind of society are we? We need to change hearts and minds.
Just a couple of resources, additional resources we have at the state in conjunction with, or led by the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, we've developed 8 hours of training for law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges that we can shrink into any amount of space. And one of the things I do a lot of is travel around the state doing teachings and trainings, and we can shrink it into just these are some of the red flags that we see. Additionally, with the new juvenile code, I know around the state a lot of people have had trouble even grasping what CHINS is, and Judge Lovett is an excellent resource for that. So if you're involved in the juvenile courts, I think he really understands it and uses it in a way that we're not seeing in the rest of the state. If your hearts and minds are not grabbed by some of the things that you'll hear today and some of the things that Judge Camacho and Judge Lovett have said, also remember the court of public opinion. We had a 14-year-old charged with prostitution in one of our middle districts, and the DA, who actually, of course, had nothing to do with that girl being charged in the middle of the night, said the outcry against him was bigger, in just a court of public opinion, was bigger and harder than anything he had encountered prosecuting multiple death penalty cases. So just remember that out there. And additionally, the municipal courts are where we're seeing a lot of our demand that's where we're seeing a lot of demand. So it's not just our state courts and our solicitor's offices, but also just our municipal courts, and some of our individual cities and smaller towns are really trying to focus on demand. So it really is important that everyone is working together here.
Thank you all very much. I do think we successfully went over by a few minutes, so. Thanks.